We're getting closer and closer to the Culture Proof Conference 2024, and we could not be more excited.
Yes, it's a great time for the whole family, a great time of ministry, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, grandparents, everybody, the kids. We have something for them as well. Of course, we have the Culture Proof kids, Culture Proof teens. They're going to have some great speakers. It's going to be led by our Maria Hamilton, the third. And also Mark and Amy Warren. And so,
that's right,
man, the kids are going to be equipped, and you can have some great discussions and conversations with them as you head back home.
We are so excited. This year's conference is hosted by Faith Baptist Church in Bartlett, Tennessee. When registration opens, you will be among the first to know. If you go to cultureproof.net, make sure you join our email list, because we are going to blast out open registration to that list first. If you are a part of that email list, you will be among the first to register. And rumor has it that there's a special treat involved for those who register early. So stay connected, cultureproof.net, cultureproof.net. We're super excited about our guests who are all joining to talk about one thing: resisting the cultural trends that rival the truth. We're going to be talking about the ways that we can remain culture proof, from scientific apologetics, biblical apologetics, cultural apologetics. How do we live in this world as faithful followers of Christ? We're going to target every age group, so make sure you show up and bring your entire family.
Yes, we're going to have a great lineup of speakers, which you'll be able to view their bios on the website, cultureproof.net. Once you go on, Abraham Hamilton III, Miki Addison. We're going to have Dr. Jason Lau, Dr. Kathy Cook, and others.
Dr. Renton Rathbun, Dr. Lee Brand. We are super excited. Dr. Taryn Dames. I feel like by next conference, I'm going to also have my doctorate, just because it kind of flows. Anyway, we're super excited about what the Lord is doing, and we want you to join us. The Culture Proof Conference happening July 18th through the 20th at Faith Baptist Church in Bartlett, Tennessee. Stay connected, because more information about that is rolling out just around the corner. You're going to find that at cultureproof.net, cultureproof.net. Make sure you join the email list. We can't wait. Thanks for checking out Culture Proof. I'm Miki.
And I'm Will.
And today we are talking about the spirit behind radicalization. And we are listening to some of the words of the radicals. We began the week, the week is still pretty new, but we set our hearts last week that we were going to talk about what's happening on college campuses all across this country, talk about the protests. But I think in order to talk about the protests, you can't just start at the protests. You have to look at what's driving these protests. How have we, even as Christian parents, contributed to this by providing the soldiers for this war, right? This war of ideologies that I would say that gets reflected in the way the students are carrying on today. So we want to kind of continue that discussion just a little bit and just show that there is a consistency in what underpins these movements. I think when we point that out, it'll become really clear that we are, as the Bible already tells us, we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, right? That there are principalities and that there's wickedness in places that we can't see with our natural eye. But the Lord wants us to know that those places actually exist and that there are entities that operate in those places.
Yeah, what we're looking at is the long game. The enemy, he's very patient. And so the thing is, when we look at what's happening now, like you said, it didn't just spring up all of a sudden.
That's right.
This has been years and years in the making. And there's been some things happening in our areas of higher learning to promote this type of stuff that we're seeing right now. So we'll get into that.
Yeah. Before we do, I've got to do two things. One, I want to say a huge thank you to our program sponsor, BJU Press Homeschool. We appreciate them helping us preserve a biblical worldview in our children. It's important to us that we make it known. It is our aim to preserve a biblical worldview in our children. We have chosen a curriculum that helps us in that conviction. If that is something that is important to you, then you may want to check out our friends at bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. They are the premier sponsor of the Culture Proof podcast, and we are so thankful for their support. Learn how they can help you by going to bjupresshomeschool.com. All right. So I want to say that. And I also have to issue a disclaimer. If you normally listen or watch our podcast with younger viewers, because of the nature of some of the clips that we're going to play, and because of some of the information that we want to draw out, we have to issue a disclaimer and say that this particular episode may not be suitable for young listeners. In fact, many of you who listen to our podcast or watch our videos over on our YouTube channel, you know that our kids actually edit our videos, and we trust them to do that. The Lord has, given them a bit of a talent in that. But we're not even having them edit this video because we think some of the content and some of the conversation may be just a little bit graphic. And we want to carefully navigate that. But we do want to expose the darkness that is behind the radicalization of young people in our country. This was in part sparked by an article that I read from the Daily Wire's website. And I thought, man, coupling that with this expose that I've been listening to about the Weather Underground, the genesis of it, how these young people were radicalized, I thought, oh my goodness, it was so apparent that we are not dealing with flesh and blood, that we really are dealing with something that is quite spiritual.
Yeah, definitely. It's apparent. You can see the enemy's handwriting all over this, and it's something to see and check out what's going on now and see the similarities. It's the same type of spirit, that's going on now, and so but this has come from somewhere that people have been trained. There's been some discipleship happening.
Yes.
There's been in the wrong way.
That's right.
That's right. And so once again, my lament of the enemy taking these things more seriously than the church. That people of the world and people with different agendas can see how these things work and how it can work in their benefit, and use things that Christians that we should be using, discipleship, training our children up, for their purposes, and we see a lot of wickedness coming from that.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think one of the biggest tools that we overlook is the way that God sees children and the way that God sees young people. And you even think about the disciples wanting to keep the children away from Jesus, almost sort of like, don't get in the way, don't bother. And Jesus is like, no, don't forbid them coming to me. Such is the kingdom of heaven. And to have that kind of comparison, but then also, so there's a metaphor there. But at the same time, there is the reality that these children are precious to Jesus, right? They are precious to the Father. And so when you think about that, you think about how young people are being radicalized in our country. We have neglected them. We have turned them over to those who are the enemies of God. And we have said, by our actions, we have said, you can do something better with our kids than we can do with them. And so please have at it. And I think that's been tragic to the point that you're making. All right, here's the article that I came across from the Daily Wire. It's pro-Hamas protesters at the University of Chicago demand HIV tests. It's even difficult for me to read the headline. They demand Plan B and some other objects that imply there's going to be sexual activity happening at these protests or at these encampments. Which, when you read that, there's almost a part of you that kind of wants to like, well, that's ridiculous. Like they're not even, but this is a part of the radicalization. And we're going to play some clips to make that case for you. This is not something that we're making up, but again, we have to issue a firm disclaimer that this particular episode of Culture Proof may not be suitable for some of our younger listeners. We are not even having our kids edit this particular podcast episode in an attempt to be vigilant to protect them from things that we don't want to introduce to them. Okay, so I want to read through a little bit of this Daily Wire article, and then I want to play a clip from a podcast that I cannot recommend. And I'm telling you, I can't recommend it because it is explicit. Of course, you're dealing with people who are God haters, and so they don't care about the type of language they use. However, I will say this, the podcast is incredibly insightful as far as, well, maybe it reveals the insights of these organizations and these organizers, what they were thinking. and how they formulated their strategies for radicalizing young people and then terrorizing this country in the late 1960s.
And it's an amazing thing that they can have a podcast talking about this, or, some episodes of a show talking about this, out in the open.
Yeah.
Because these things that are being said, it's like, man, how can they just out freely? Well, it tells you the times that we live in now and where things have gone to.
Yeah. I think it speaks to the point that you're making. I think it speaks to almost a justification for what happened in the late 1960s. You talk about the Days of Rage and you talk about the occupation of Columbia University. I think being able to talk about this openly with Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers and Eric Mann, I think these people being able to express this on a podcast that actually has sponsorship, right? That they were a part of terrorizing this country. It shows that we have normalized that as a part of our fabric, right? Like we've said, well, they were doing that righteously. And I think some people would argue that they had undertaken a righteous cause. And by any means necessary, they could arrive at their desired outcome.
And look, especially with the things that we've been dealing with as of late, critical theory. And,
yes.
and I know that that's an old thing, but
but it's ongoing.
Yeah, it's ongoing. It's been ramped up in this country. So I believe a podcast like this, or, having that freedom, they have it because this is where we are.
Yes.
That's celebrated. That's like, man, they're woke, man. That's, so this right now is not where the country was in 69 or 68,
right. Which I think is what so frightened Americans, right? I think this is why, the Weather Underground was like, wanted
underground.
It's so crazy. Underground. Yeah, exactly. It wasn't the weather above ground, right? This is why they were underground, because it was not something that was easy for them to execute or to carry out. You fast forward, then you've got, the protests that were quote unquote mostly peaceful, where they're going through and destroying neighborhoods. They're in Chicago, walking through the shopping district and just walking into these high-end establishments and carrying out what are called, smash and grabs. And why are they doing that and no one's showing up to arrest them? Well, because that kind of behavior is built on what happened in the late 60s. It's a part of the radical framework, right? That you terrorize communities, you push and push and push until you feel like you have secured the results that you desire.
That's right.
So here we go. Again, back to the Daily Wire. Pro-Hamas protesters at the University of Chicago released a list of supply needs for their encampment. This is last week, that included items for sexual activity. Okay, so the University of Chicago United for Palestine, which is a leftist group, according to the Daily Wire, committed to Palestinian liberation, this group is, and racial justice at the University of Chicago, created a list of supply needs that included Vaseline, HIV tests, Plan B, and other things. There's some things I just am not even.
I mean, you can go ahead and say it, because I think, we put the disclaimer out there.
Yeah.
And I think people need to know what's going on. So it's fine.
So in this list, there's something called dental dams, which I didn't even know what that was. It is actually on the CDC's website. And I will just confess. So I was like, okay, I have never even heard of this.
Yeah.
So I had to look it up. It's on the CDC's website, and it is a type of protective mechanism for people to engage in oral sex.
So you have to think, like, why are they requesting these things?
For their protests, for their encampments, because of the injustice that is being suffered by Palestinians.
Wow.
Well, okay. And there are other things on this list. We may get to it, but that's the question that is right for us to ask, right? We get an answer and we get a better understanding in two ways. First and foremost, to understand the biblical implications of when you are talking about a rebellion against God and whatever manifestation that is, however it looks, when you're talking about resisting, rejecting, rebelling against the ordinances of God, the commands of God, then you will have indiscriminate sexual practices.
That's right.
This is a part of the demonic activity that takes place in any rebellion. If you read the scriptures and you look at the nations that the Lord drove out of the land that he was giving to his chosen people, Israel, you will find that they had these abhorrent sexual practices. And it wasn't just, indiscriminate sexual activity, the kind of activity that just they felt like engaging in.
Mhm.
It was the type of sexual activity that was engaged in as a form of worship, as
Yeah.
a form of an offering to the idols that they were serving. And so when you have that knowledge,
Mhm.
and then you trace the roots of the radicalization of young people in this country back to the days of rage in the late 1960s, looking at organizations like the Weather Underground, how they took their cues from, communist culture, third world cultures,
Mhm.
so that they could get the biggest impact that they desired.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It then starts to all make sense
Yeah.
that there must be sexual activity. There must be a rejection of the American norms of sexual ethic. Why? Because whether we like it or not, sexual ethic, what we would call an American sexual ethic, comes out of a biblical conviction.
Yeah.
Even though people don't like to acknowledge that, that is where it comes from. We have a clip, and I want to get into playing that clip here from a podcast that, again, I can't recommend it, but where this is openly expressed that in order to make radicals, you've got to get these young people to reject who they are.
Mm.
So they have got to go, whole hog into this new world where there is no residue of their old morals, the tired morals of their parents.
Right.
And part of that distinction becomes indiscriminate sexual activity.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you'll hear it's almost they talk about it as being a bonding thing.
Yes.
And we know the spiritual nature of sex, and what
My
God
goodness.
has intended for it to be.
For a
And
husband
for
and
a
a wife.
husband and a wife.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
right. It should be a bond, but you see it being used here for things that are wicked.
To create an entire, to create like a community bond.
Yeah.
It is so demonic when you hear them in their own words expressing this. So we're going to play the clip again. Disclaimer on this podcast episode, we hate to do it, but this information is so important for us to understand that when we are standing up in our culture against these radical displays, it's not just our dislike for people, or it's not just that, oh, they make me uncomfortable, or this is icky, or like even when you read the Daily Wire article, you might think, oh, that's just crazy. These things have roots in the demonic. They have roots in a rebellion against God that is expressed in all types of activity that run counter to the authoritative word of God. All right, here we go.
Rethinking every part of their lives, what they read, what they eat, even who they sleep with.
There was just so much experimentation with sex with women, sex with men, sex in orgies, all of that.
Many weathermen have dropped out of college. These are still their undergraduate years. And these are kids who'd grown up in the 1950s with all the boring expectations about gender roles, monogamy, no sex until marriage.
For me, and I think for many other women, it was kind of a freeing experience.
Eleanor Stein is a cadre member in New York. When she joins Weathermen, she's married to her teenage sweetheart.
Relationships with men and how much power men had over us in big ways and small ways had limited us.
For Eleanor, smashing monogamy is a feminist gesture. It shows her being married isn't something you have to do just because you're a woman. You have agency. You can do what you want.
And I left a relationship. It was voluntary. I wasn't forced to do it, but I was pushed to do it. I don't look back on that as a terrible thing.
But for others, like Kathy Wilkerson, the sexual free-for-all feels oppressive.
It was confusing because a lot of weathermen were women. So it was not immediately apparent to me the profound kind of sexism that existed in it. Men could sleep with whoever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, basically.
So while free love sounds great on paper, in Weathermen it could veer into dark territory. Some members feel pressured. Others who are coming out as queer feel judged. But to many Weathermen, sex with comrades builds a bond, breaks down the selfishness of individuality, makes you part of the collective. It is a bit ridiculous, but there's also something serious about people dedicated to changing the world, starting that process by changing themselves.
I think this is incredible that they believe that engaging in this type of activity is getting rid of the person they used to be, that they are no longer associated with those, restrictive practices that would have been those of their parents, right? And that they believe that this is the adoption of a new identity.
It's spiritual, y'all.
It is so
It's
spiritual. Guys, when we read these headlines, we must never just read them sort of, in isolation or just
Right.
take them at face value.
Right.
If the word of God can be trusted, and we know that it can be trusted, then we can believe the Lord when he reveals to us that we're not wrestling against flesh and blood.
That's right.
So when you've got these articles that uncover that these people who set up these encampments at the University of Chicago, which, by the way, I also learned that there were similar demands that were made by the students in or at UCLA's campus before they were shut down,
Wow.
that they were going to be engaging in the type of activity that would say on the surface, you would say, you're not serious about what you're doing. You're not serious about what you're doing. Now, I can understand the jokes because when you continue with the Daily Wire article, they're requesting gluten-free food and all kinds of things that I could see people joking about that. But the planned sexual activity that will characterize these occupations, this is not happenstance. This is not just a coincidence. This is woven into what would be the DNA of radicalization in this country. And it's a deeply spiritual practice,
Yes.
right? It is a disassociation from those things that are moral, those things that point to the holiness of God. And it's an adoption of everything that would reject who God is.
Yeah, it's definitely spiritual. It's rebellion. It's rebellion against God first and foremost, and his standard. You heard it in that clip where they talk about they grew up in the 50s,
Yes.
and, where it was like no sex before marriage and stuff. But that's what God has said, and so the rebellion, we have to remember, is against a holy God.
Yeah.
And so when you see these sexual practices and now they're calling for these things to be brought to these occupations, and it's like, man, it's obvious that the enemy is all over this. These
Yes.
encampments, they are planning to bond.
Yes.
What does that
Right,
mean?
right.
Well, we understand what sex does.
Yes, yes.
And so they may not even understand all that the aspects spiritually.
No, but the enemy
But the
that
enemy does.
has enticed them
Yeah.
absolutely does, right?
Yeah.
It's almost, back to Balaam, right? Okay, so we cannot pronounce a judgment, like we can't curse the people of God, but we can invite them into the type of practice where
Wow.
God is forced to judge them.
Wow.
So we can entice them sexually,
Yep.
and they will take the bait, they will engage, and God, because he is who he says he is, will judge them. So the enemy absolutely recognizes this. I want to draw attention to something before we got into that clip, and I should have actually set it up, but the first voice that you hear as we go into the clip is the late Kathy Boudin. And Kathy Boudin was one of those founding members of the Weather Underground. She died at 78 years old, I want to say, in 2022. She was a part of that bank robbery. I think the Brinks bank
Brinks.
robbery. And 2 officers were killed. She served like 20 years for felony murder. And then later, through a series of events, she gets out. And part of her parole is that she starts working in the social work arena, but she eventually makes her way back to the university setting to be an adjunct professor
How about that?
to teach. And I have a picture here. Here we go. So this is Kathy Boudin, and Kathy Boudin is also, interestingly enough, she's no longer living, but who is living is her son. This is Chesa Boudin. And Chesa Boudin is the district attorney for San Francisco, which I think is just absolutely fascinating to think about. If you're not watching, I'm putting these pictures up over on our YouTube channel. So if you want to catch the video, you can go and see who these people are. But they were not Chesa Boudin, and I want to be careful here, but Kathy Boudin and her husband were a part of the Weather Underground. And in fact, I was listening to this sort of history of the Weather Underground on this podcast series. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating to me is that on the day that they go to rob this bank, and you've got the murder or the death of these cops as a result of it, Chesa Boudin, who is like a toddler around this time, very young boy, is left with a babysitter, told by his parents that they would be back, and they never came back. Well, at least, not for like 20 years or so. And what eventually happens is Chesa Boudin is then adopted and is raised by Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers. Guys, I'm not even making it up.
And so now he holds a position.
And so now
in
he's
San
the
Francisco?
district attorney. So why am I saying that? I'm saying that some of these things that are happening around us are the result of these things being actively trained in people, right?
Yes, it's on purpose.
Transgenerational. They have been made disciples, made followers of a certain ideology. And I think it's something that we can't overlook. We can't pretend that it doesn't exist. There is something else that I want to point out about the protest and what we're seeing today in our country, right, at large. So when you think about the way the indoctrination is happening in our country, there are several features of that indoctrination, right? One is that you have the presentation of an idea. There is the expectation that if it doesn't meet with tradition, it's going to be resisted. So then the process is, well, what we have to do is tear down what you believe, tear down who you once were, and then press into you a sense of guilt and remorse over who you are. Okay, so that you can adopt this ideology, which, by the way, is the only ideology that offers you any type of hope. It's the only ideology that offers you forgiveness. This is what critical theory does. This is what critical race theory does, okay, because it came out of critical theory. And by the way, a lot of these people in the Weather Underground, this was their ideology. Again, Bernadine Dorn was in her last year of law school when she dropped out to join the Weather Underground. These people have like an attorney's mind.
Yeah.
Okay. They have this kind of background. They're working in this arena because they want to affect change. But if you think about what we see happening now, so there is the self-hatred, a collective self-hatred that is present in our country, where you've got to be told that something is wrong with you and that it is systemic. It's in you. It is a part of what makes you who you are. And the only way that you can find relief from that is that you confess it. You've got to own it. And then you've got to adopt our principles. And what we will do is we will offer you our version of forgiveness. Now, that's what's happening today.
Yeah.
And you might think, oh, well, that they just started doing that. Actually, no, they didn't. And we're going to play the next clip because this actually goes back to the 1960s at the genesis of the Weather Underground, where you've got these white radicals who believe that there is something just wrong with them as white people. And so what they want to do is they want to suffer, right? And so they engage in these practices where they sit around and they just berate one another. And this is supposed to be sort of a new birth for them. All right. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's the clip.
How do you transform yourselves? Get rid of your bourgeois hang-ups, your racist or sexist upbringing and unconscious bias. For the Weathermen, they take another page from international revolutionaries.
The concept of criticism, self-criticism came out of the Chinese Communist Party.
Eric Mann, Bill's friend from SDS, now leads the Boston chapter of Weathermen.
It's actually a healthy part of every organization, evaluating your work, owning up to your own mistakes. That's all good.
Okay, let me just stop for 1 second right there, okay? And we'll pick up right here. But let me just jump in and say, so that's Eric Mann, okay? And I'm going to put up a picture of Eric Mann just real quick here. Okay, so here's Eric Mann, radical member of the Weather Underground, okay? Talking about what has to happen, okay? You have to come face to face with who you are, all right? And we'll hear a little bit more from him. But before I go any further, let me just remind our listeners and our viewers that Eric Mann is the one who is credited with training Patrisse Cullors.
Wow.
Who founded Black Lives
There you go.
I can't make it up. Who founded Black Lives Matter? We know this. She has acknowledged, or did acknowledge, during her time of serving, as the founding president of Black Lives Matter. Of course, she stepped down when it got real hot. That she was spending $3.2 million on houses.
Right.
Okay, with helicopter landing pads. Okay, of course it got hot, and so she resigned, stepped down from that position. She's no longer in that position. But my point is this. The things that we saw as pages taken out of the playbook of these radicals, right? These were the types of things that they were truly, truly systematically trained in.
Yeah.
This is what you're going to do. So you're going to stop traffic, even down to pulling down monuments, okay? Even up to and including what we're talking about right now, changing how people see themselves, changing what they think about who they are. All right, we'll go back to the clip. Here we go.
That wasn't what this was about. Let's be very clear.
You'd be in the living room of somebody's apartment. There were probably anywhere from 20 to 40 people there.
And one poor person in the middle.
It was crowded, it was sweaty, it was scary.
And usually it would be me or somebody leading the interrogation.
I know I found myself several times sitting in the middle of the room on a chair with a circle of people around me asking me these devastating questions.
It would start out heavy and get heavier and heavier and heavier.
Anything that you might consider a bourgeois hang-up would be criticized because it would be holding you back.
There were questions about money, for example.
Is that not your white privilege?
We saw you going into a movie.
Is it not? I don't say it's racism, but it may be bordering on it.
You were seen.
People were dying in Vietnam and you did this, and then everybody would jump in and people would use some personal stuff that they knew about you, against you.
Like I was the scum of the earth.
Counter-revolutionary.
And generally the person sort of shrinks into the chair.
I felt that it was absurd and that there was no reason why I had to sit there and be subjected to this.
And then the group would forgive them, like Catholicism.
Where you get whipped more, and the more you get whipped, the more you feel like you're becoming purified.
I have sinned and I realize all the error of my ways.
You just destroy somebody and take them apart, and then you put them back together again in your model.
I subscribed at the time to the ethic that there was corruption, racism inside of me, and that I had an obligation to rid myself of those, and that going through this collective process was part of it.
That would be the end of a successful criticism, self-criticism. The person would be crying, deeply apologetic. And then, of course, then everybody could be so supportive because the person had didn't have a leg to stand on, no self-respect.
No self-respect.
Amazing.
The person is broken down. The person is torn down. The person is made to feel worthless because of who he or she is, what he or she is able to do, right? And then collapse into the arms of the people who are berating them at that moment and receive a type of forgiveness because you have now acknowledged that you really are scum. You really are nothing. Now listen, that's in the late 1960s.
And it's amazing. We see that stuff happening
Come
now
on.
with the
Come
white
on.
privilege. He said
Yes,
it,
yes.
but you got to imagine. So this stuff has infiltrated the church. So you'll have people who never heard of this type of stuff, but it's still being pumped in through these writings.
And they are
these
giving
books.
mental assent to it, heart assent to it. They are trying to find ways to justify it with scripture.
Yeah.
To make it be reconciled to the gospel, or to reconcile it to the gospel, I should say.
Yeah. And so they're experiencing these things, these feelings, this guilt and all of that. And it comes from this communist stuff, you know? And it's amazing that we have even allowed for this to infiltrate the church.
Yeah. And think about it. So it comes from this communism, and they are saying what they did was try to discover what worked for the communists. So they go to these third world countries. Like, how were they breaking down the citizens of their countries? How are the communist dictators breaking down the citizens of their countries? Well, they're doing things like this.
Yeah.
And so, you imagine that this is happening in the 60s. They're doing this to themselves. Okay. But it doesn't just stay in these little houses or apartments where you've got 30 or 40 people in a room, you put a person in the middle and then you berate them. This has spilled out into the public square. where people are told that they're racist, where they are told that they have a type of privilege that they need to see how they can give it up. It's being adopted, and then it's making its way into our schools. It's making its way into our churches. And when I say it's making, that's not to suggest that, oh, this is something new. I understand that it is comfortably there, but I'm talking about as it flows out.
Yeah.
This is the genesis of it.
Yeah. And it's most egregious to me that it has infiltrated the church.
Yes.
Because we have the word of God
100%.
that tells us how we are to relate to one another.
Yep.
It's just amazing. When I think about that, I'm like, it should never have any type of foothold within the church.
Yeah.
Never.
You know, I want to get to what I think is probably one of the biggest cautions that we could present when we're talking about how we notice the people are taking up arms, and it's not in the ways that we might think. But before I get to that, I want to remind our listeners that we've got a conference that is coming up July 18th through the 20th in Bartlett, Tennessee. It is the Culture Proof Conference, and the theme just so happens to be resist. So all of the speakers are going to be informing and equipping you in practical ways how you can resist the cultural trends that rival the truth and remain culture proof. We've got Bible believing Christians who are not afraid to be called hateful, who are not afraid to be called bigots or to be scared into silence. And they are going to tell you the biblical truth about how we engage and stand faithfully in this generation. We want to invite you to go to cultureproof.net.
Yes, go to cultureproof.net. All the information about the conference is there. You can register today. It's a family conference. We have something for all age groups, and it's ministry. It's not babysitting. We have something for the children, the teens, the young adults. And so go to cultureproof.net to register today.
All right. So getting back to today's topic, the spirit behind radicalization. One of the things I think that often frightens people is the thought that these radicals would take up physical arms. And I think that is something that should concern people, right? Like you don't want, people shooting up neighborhoods and terrorizing neighborhoods, taking the lives of innocent individuals. But I think there's a part of the equipping or the radicalization of radicals that does not involve any physical weapons, but it is the mental weapon of taking over a person's mind. And one of the ways that you do that is by requiring that the literature of the ideology or the ideological conviction is consumed by all of the adherents, right? All of the radicals have to be reading this information. You think about where we are today, How to Be an Anti-Racist, the critical race theory books. You think of White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, and the like, all of these books. That's why when we start talking about what is being housed in our public schools by way of their libraries, that's why it's a battle. Because they recognize that, again, this is a part of sort of like the mental attack on people's minds. And this was understood in the 1960s. We're going to play a clip now where you are going to hear the voice of Jamal Joseph, who was a member of the Black Panthers, also imprisoned for his participation in what was seen at the time as a domestic type terrorism on this country, where he talks about his kind of entry into the Black Panthers. And at the age of 15, he was so roused and so moved by their no father. That is important to know. It's important background. He was raised by his grandmother. Okay. So when he saw the strength of the Black Panthers, when he saw the organization of the Black Panthers, the unity of the Black Panthers, he wanted to be a part of that. Let's pick up with that clip. Listen.
Months after Dr. King's death, Jamal shows up at Panther headquarters in Brooklyn.
Older brothers and sisters are looking really, really cool with their leather coats, army fatigue jackets, fro. Some of the sisters had their African head wraps.
Someone begins a political education class, explaining the 10-point program, what the Panthers stand for.
I think the brother's on point number 5, which is about education. We want an education that teaches us our true history and the true nature of this decadent American society. I jump up, choose me, brother, arm me. Whole room gets quiet. Brother says, come here, young brother.
Jamal walks up to the desk. The man reaches down into a drawer.
I'm like, oh man, look how far out he's reached. He's gonna give me a gun. And he hands me a stack of books. Autobiography of Malcolm X, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, Wretched at Earth by Franz Fanon, Little Red Book. And I said, excuse me, brother, I thought you were gonna arm me. And he said, excuse me, young brother, I just did.
Yes, because that is the mode, right? That is the means. That's the weight and the heft of what we see happening even in our kids today. How are they being armed? How are they actively taking up arms against us as their parents, against sound theology that we would have entrusted to them? It's because they are being offered something different.
Yeah.
They're being offered something different that radicalizes them to the core. So when we look at the spirit behind this radicalization and we hear the words of the radicals, we can understand that the things we see happening today are not new. They are things that have been repackaged and passed down from one generation to the next.
That's right.
So what do we want to say? When we resist those cultural trends that rival the truth, we remain culture proof. Until next time, Lord willing.
God bless.